DragonSword Awakening just revealed a ridiculous amount of information about what's coming next, and honestly, this game may be heading in a much bigger direction than I originally expected. We're talking about 4 new heroes, a massive new story and map expansion, harder endgame content, stronger world bosses, English voice acting, new costumes, quality of life changes, console plans, and even potential co-op. So today, I'm going through the biggest announcements, what actually matters, and what I think DragonSword Awakening needs to do next if it wants to keep growing. Let's start with what is probably going to be the biggest immediate draw for a lot of players. 4 new heroes are planned for the second half of 2026, and these aren't characters that you have to worry about being locked behind some gacha system. The first one arriving is Ryza. Ryza is currently targeted for around October, and she looks completely different from a lot of the existing roster. Her primary attribute is shock, and her combat revolves heavily around mobility. She uses a spear, but the really interesting part is what she can do with it. Ryza can throw her spear and then teleport directly to its location. So instead of simply attacking from the ground, you're essentially using her spear as a movement anchor. Throw it, teleport to it, continue the attack, and keep moving. And this isn't just limited to ground combat. Her kit appears to lean heavily into aerial combat as well, with the ability to continue attacking while airborne. You can see her repeatedly thrusting through the air, which allows her to stay airborne for surprisingly long periods of time. She also appears to have a very fast dash and teleport-based movement, giving her a combat style that is much more aggressive and mobile than what we've seen from some of the other current heroes. Her signal skill appears to be connected to the same mechanic. The basic idea seems to be that she throws a spear, creates her position, and then immediately teleports to it when the signal becomes available. That gives her a very distinctive playstyle, and honestly, this is probably one of the most exciting additions they've shown so far, because it isn't simply another character using a slightly different version of an existing combat loop. Ryza's movement itself is part of her identity, but Ryza isn't alone. There are 3 more heroes planned after her. The first is Jerome. Jerome is being positioned as a knockdown specialist, and that's important because the developers specifically pointed out that the current roster doesn't have a dedicated character filling that role in the way that they want. He's also a smaller character wielding a massive weapon, and his combat includes mechanics tied to super armor destruction. He can also use a grab that progresses through multiple stages. So, Jerome seems to be designed around breaking enemies down and then capitalizing on those openings. And then we have Veronica. Veronica is probably one of the more unusual concepts because she combines gunplay with close-range martial arts. The developers specifically said that the character was inspired by community requests for a hero who fights with their fists. Her primary attribute is stun, and her combat can transition between ranged gun attacks and close-quarter martial arts. That gives her a pretty different identity from the existing roster. And then there's Logan. Logan is being developed as a tank-oriented hero, using a large shield and focusing on protecting his allies. The developers have said that they want to make his kit more versatile before release, so its final implementation could still change. The exact release order for Jerome, Veronica, and Logan isn't locked down yet, but the 4-character roadmap is clear. Ryza's first, followed by Jerome, Veronica, and Logan. And it's not just about adding characters to the roster. The developers are also working on hero quests. These are designed to explore stories that aren't necessarily covered by the main campaign and give individual heroes more narrative attention. That means new characters aren't simply being dropped into the game as combat units. There is additional story material being planned around them as well. Othello's hero quest has been identified as one of the upcoming, followed by content connected to Ryza. So if you like DragonSword character stories, this is something worth keeping an eye on. Now we get into the much bigger reveal. The developers are planning a major story and map extension centered around an area called the Sky Islands. This is intended to continue the larger DragonSword story and eventually take us through the remaining stories surrounding the 6 true dragons. We've currently only seen part of that larger story, so the Sky Islands are being positioned as a major continuation rather than just another side area. The target for this expansion is currently the second half of next year. Yes, that's a long way away, but there's a pretty important reason for that. The development team is small, and the developers themselves have talked about the difficulty of producing this amount of content with their current resources. So I wouldn't interpret the long timeline as the game being abandoned or forgotten. If anything, it tells you that the developers are thinking about DragonSword as something they want to continue building, rather than simply releasing and walking away from. There is also still uncertainty surrounding exactly how the Sky Islands expansion will be distributed. The developers have indicated that it could potentially be released in multiple parts rather than arriving as one giant update, and whether the major story expansion itself will be free or paid content hasn't been completely finalized in the information we're working from. So I would not treat the pricing as confirmed yet. Now, this is probably the part I'm personally most interested in, because one of the biggest problems with a game like DragonSword is that once you've reached the upper end of progression, what exactly are you supposed to do? The developers know this, and they're already planning to increase the game's endgame difficulty. The Trial Tower is expected to receive additional difficulty levels. They're also considering making raids more difficult, and one of the concepts mentioned was an extinction difficulty beyond the current nightmare level. The developers also believe players are clearing the Trial Tower faster than expected, so they're looking at pushing the ceiling higher, and the same goes for hunting content and world bosses. More difficult versions are being considered, while existing world bosses are also being strengthened because the developers believe they're currently too easy. And honestly, I can understand that. If you've reached a point where you're deleting a world boss in seconds, there's not much of an endgame challenge left. The important thing though is that these higher difficulty levels are not currently being designed around exclusive mandatory rewards. In other words, you aren't necessarily going to have to complete the hardest possible content just to remain competitive. It's more about giving players who enjoy pushing the combat system something difficult to master. I actually think that's a pretty healthy approach for this type of game. The developers also want to add additional world bosses, and are looking at improving the existing ones rather than simply throwing more enemies into the game. This is part of a broader effort to give players more things to do once they've reached the higher levels of progression. Now here's something that could have a pretty significant effect on the game's presentation. English voice acting is being worked on. The developers have acknowledged the issues surrounding the game's English localization and are putting resources toward improving it. The current plan discussed was to target English voice acting around December, assuming development proceeds successfully. Japanese voice acting is also being considered afterward. And I think this is actually important because DragonSword has a very anime-inspired presentation. The combat, character design, cinematics, and story all lean heavily into that style. So having stronger localization and eventually English voice acting can make the game substantially more accessible to players who bounced off the current presentation. That doesn't mean every problem with the translation disappears overnight. The developers have made it clear that this is going to take time, but it's something they're actively prioritizing. And then we get to the part where things become a little less certain. There are a number of other characters that have appeared in development material and concept imagery. Some of these characters are not officially confirmed as playable, so I want to make that distinction very clear. You may have seen some people online talking about future banners, characters, or release orders. Don't assume those are official. The developers have confirmed some future characters and shown others that the exact order and release schedule beyond the immediate roadmap can still change. One example is Lynn. The developers have indicated that they intend to make Lynn playable eventually, but she is not planned for this year. There are also several other characters that have appeared in development imagery whose names and playable status haven't been fully established. So there's clearly a large pipeline being considered, but I would treat those as future possibilities, not a guaranteed character roadmap. And for everyone who doesn't play on PC, there is some potentially good news. The developers have confirmed that they're considering bringing DragonSword Awakening to PlayStation, with PlayStation being the current priority among console platforms. The PS5 version is still in the research planning stage though, so there isn't a release date I would give you right now. As for the Nintendo Switch 2, the developers have indicated that bringing the game there would be more difficult, and GeForce Now isn't currently part of their plans either. So if you're waiting for the console version, PlayStation is the platform I'd be watching most closely. Now let's talk about something that's a little less consequential to the actual game, but is obviously going to get attention. More costumes. Eileen is getting the new costume with an Orbis-themed aesthetic. Reina is also getting a costume in a similar style, and these aren't necessarily just character skins either. The developers have shown costumes that include magic weapon cosmetics as well. Kalian is also expected to receive a rabbit-themed outfit, which I'm sure is going to get a certain portion of the community very excited. And then there's Othello. His upcoming costume is designed around a bard-like aesthetic, and one of the more interesting details is that his spear is being redesigned to resemble a guitar. So there's clearly experimenting with more than just recoloring existing outfits. There are also additional costumes being worked on for the future, including swimsuit-related content. But again, these things take time. The developers have explained that they currently have a very limited number of people dedicated to costume production, so they can't simply pump out new outfits every few weeks. If you're waiting for DragonSword to become a competitive PvP game, I wouldn't hold your breath. Developers don't believe traditional PvP or ranked modes fit the game's design particularly well, so those aren't currently a priority. What they are considering is expanding open world co-op. This is still in research and development, however. The game has already transitioned from being designed around a purely single-player experience into supporting multiplayer functionality in certain areas, and expanding that further is difficult for a small team. So I will consider open world co-op a possibility, not an upcoming feature with a release date. This is where the reality of the team size become important. Things like housing, fishing, petting animals, romance, marriage systems, large-scale seasonal events, these aren't currently priorities, and some of them aren't planned at all. The developers have explained that adding something as simple as a petting animation could require additional animation work across a huge number of creatures. So while those features sound small from the player's perspective, they're not necessarily small from the development side. And with a team this size, they have to decide where their resources actually matter. Fortunately, some of the changes coming much sooner are things that actually affect how you play the game every day. The upcoming patch that landed today is adding an improved quality of life system for dungeon rewards. Instead of having to stop and manually open every chest after clearing the dungeon, rewards will be obtained automatically. Multiplayer matchmaking is also being improved. Dungeon rewards are being looked at as well, with the possibility of increasing their quantity significantly. Daily timers for world bosses and certain quests are also being adjusted, which should make the game's recurring activities less restrictive. And that's important because one of the recurring complaints has been that some of the game's rewards simply aren't worth the amount of time required to obtain them. The developers have acknowledged that. Adventure difficulty is also being reconsidered. The current maximum difficulty isn't necessarily challenging enough once you've reached the highest level of progression. The developers are looking at increasing it further, potentially to level 7 or 8, and this is where the game's balance philosophy becomes interesting. There aren't currently immediate plans for major character nerfs. The developers want to collect long-term data before deciding whether large-scale balance changes are necessary, so don't expect the entire meta to suddenly get flipped overnight. Equipment and character balance are longer-term priorities. There are also some progression changes coming. The developers are looking at removing some of the character material growth requirements so that character progression becomes more straightforward. Team slots are also expected to increase, which happened today. Instead of being limited to 5 slots, the plan is to increase the number to 7. We have that. The food and cooking systems are also being reworked. The lock-on system is being improved, and perhaps one of the most interesting combat additions, a perfect dodge system, being developed. That could give experienced players another layer of mastery in combat, particularly once higher difficulty content begins arriving. Another interesting change is the game's user interface. DragonSword originally had a mobile version in its development history, and some of the design decisions have remained visible in the current game. The developers now want to move away from that. They're working toward a more traditional single-player RPG interface, rather than retaining unnecessary mobile-style UI elements. They're also looking at reducing some of the excessive back-and-forth travel and quests. If you played enough of the game, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes the objective feels less like, go accomplish this, and more like, go over there, now come back here, now go back over there. The developers have heard that feedback and want to improve the quest design going forward. Interestingly, not every player requested system is going to be changed. For example, the developers aren't planning to simply turn the game exploration into a giant checklist by adding markers for every chest, puzzle, or collective. Their philosophy is that discovery is part of the experience, and they don't want the world to become a map filled with icons telling you exactly where everything is. The same goes for titles in some existing progression systems. They don't want to radically change systems that players have already invested a lot of time into unless there is a strong reason to do so. There are also plans for additional mounts, and importantly, the developers have talked about keeping some mounts available for free so that players who purchase paid mount content don't feel like their purchases are immediately undermined by an abundance of equivalent free options. It's another example of them trying to maintain a balance between optional DLC and the value of the base game. And that leads into something else they've confirmed. There will not be a traditional battle pass. DragonSword isn't being converted into the type of live service game where you're expected to purchase a seasonal progression track every few months. Whenever you obtain a new character, the developers are also looking at adding unique character acquisition animations. So instead of every hero simply being introduced through the same generic presentation, future characters can have their own dedicated arrival moment. It's a small feature, but it's the kind of thing that gives individual characters more personality. So looking at all of this together, I actually think DragonSword Awakening is in a pretty interesting position right now. The developers clearly have a lot planned. The problem is that they're also working with a very small team. And I think that's the context we have to keep in mind when looking at this roadmap. Because on paper, we're talking about new heroes, a new region, more in-game content, voice acting, costumes, multiplayer improvements, console support, and a long list of quality of life changes. That's a lot. For me, the biggest priority should be the in-game, story expansion, localization, and continued improvements to the multiplayer experience. If they can get those things right, I think DragonSword Awakening has a much better chance of continuing to grow. But that's where I'm at with DragonSword Awakening right now. There's clearly a lot coming, but I'm curious what you guys think. Which announcements matters to you most? The new heroes, Sky Islands, the harder in-game, English voice acting, or the possibility of co-op? And if you're already playing DragonSword Awakening, let me know what you think the developers need to prioritize next. I'll see you in the next one.